This is the lecture for Tuesday, December 8th, 2020, for European history. Okay. We talked about the revolution in America, which was a political revolution, where the pre-war society largely survives intact after the war, but the government changes. But one of the reasons why the American Revolution is a political revolution. Would you mind handing these out while I talk? Thank you. Anyone who's not here, just leave it in the folder. Is because our colonial society is fairly primitive. There is very few. There's a very small lower class. I mean, you've got slaves, but they're not yet in massive numbers. That'll change. And you've got indentured servants. Again, fairly small proportion of society. And you have very few aristocrats. American society in the 13 British colonies of North America is overwhelmingly middle class. And what makes middle class people distinct is our definition. We make ourselves, we support ourselves, not through inherited wealth, but through our skills. Our skills, our efforts, our work. So the virtues of being middle class are the virtues of a ruggedly independent, self-supporting person. This rugged independence is going to be useful when we are fighting the British. Thank you. And it means that one of the things that the American colonies stand for, in thought, word, and deed, is the idea of the freedom to pursue your dreams, because you're having to build those dreams in a wilderness. You're having to build those dreams with your own hands. This is not a world that you are inheriting. This is a world that you are making. And we want a government that will stay the heck out of our way while we do it. We do not want a government that supports people. We want people to support themselves. I forget one of the quotes I have on the wall here. A man must be upright. He must not be kept upright. In other words, that is our responsibility to ourselves, to work hard, be honorable, and pursue our dreams. Traditionally, in European societies, lower class is taken care of and ordered about like they're a bunch of children. And they're kept in line by the force of law, the coercive power of the state, and the dead hand of tradition. All of those things tend to keep people in their place unless they're remarkably ambitious and remarkably lucky. But as human nature has us bite the hand that feeds us, the resentment of the lower class is something that erupts violently in the form of peasant uprisings in the Middle Ages, and it's going to erupt during every social revolution that exists. You have this vicious hate coming out of the lower orders and a willingness to be absolutely brutally violent. And this is something that the Revolutionary Party counts on. They use the lower class and its anger as muscle. So when we are looking at the Enlightenment philosophies affecting old world societies like France, and later in the 20th century like Russia or China, you have a very different dynamic than was at play in the 13 colonies of British North America, which was, again, very overwhelmingly middle class. This is something that is worth remembering. One of the factors that's going to make France unstable is that while most other European societies adopted the potato, whole hog, so to speak, because the potato was so much more dowdy, more tough than a seed grain like wheat, that the cycles of hunger that had plagued Europe since the fall of Western Empire and Rome got better, became less of a factor in Britain, in Russia, in Poland, in Germany, even in Spain and Portugal and Italy. But because the French resisted the apple of the ground, which is what they call the potato, because it was not adopted in en masse in French agriculture or French cuisine until after this period, the French economy and people remain uniquely vulnerable to the cycles of hunger. And if you have a harvest that isn't quite what you hoped, or a winter that's colder than usual, France has both of these problems right before the revolution and early in the revolution. What's going to happen is, since this is a largely subsistence economy, since we're not talking about modern industrial agriculture that produces extra food, when there's a food shortage, people go hungry. When there's a persistent food shortage, people die. And if you want to understand the dark side of society, something Hobbes understood when he talked about life being short, mean, and brutal, think about the axiomatic phrase that you hear a lot in society, that any civilization is only 3 days away from complete anarchy if you take food away for 3 days, 3 complete days, no food of any kind. You will see civilized people break down and act like animals because they are hungry, but also because they're afraid of continuing to be hungry. Now, I don't necessarily believe that. I think that's a materialistic way of looking at people. But there is truth to it. There is truth that we are 3 meals away from being savages, 3 missed meals, or 3 days of missed meals away. I don't know if you've ever been hungry. I've, I've never been hungry in my life because I'm an American. But I have been poor enough not to be able to afford 3 meals a day when I was a young man for a while. And therefore, there were a couple days a week where I just didn't eat 3 meals. I was lucky to have one. I just couldn't afford more food. And that's an attention getter. Anytime you want to appreciate the power of electricity in your life, cut off the power. See what it's like. Or just the next time we have a blackout, try to remember what it's like. The same thing is true for regular food. And thank God, most Americans in modern times have no concept of genuine hunger. We say we're hungry when what we are is we're peckish. We'd like a snack. So this is a underlying problem in France, which is not going to get better before the revolution. It's going to be a cause of the revolution. And the Little Ice Age, which has made agriculture more difficult since the 1200s, is going to continue to play a factor. The Little Ice Age, by the way, ends in the middle 1800s, just around the time we start burning large amounts of coal. So it is entirely possible that man-made climate change did exist in the 1800s, and that with our massive burning of coal, we prevented another ice age from starting, at least delayed it. Okay, we talked about the 7 Years' War in the Americas. Well, the 7 Years' War plays out in Europe too. And the thing you need to understand for the purposes of our story is the 7 Years' War was France's gamble to win hegemony over the world. And France lost. Okay? It lost territory in India, it lost territory in the Caribbean, and it lost all its territory in North America. No more French Quebec. So the French, who don't like the English too much anyway, because France and England have fought wars with one another every century since the time of the Norman conquest, they want revanche. They want revenge. They want an opportunity to get back what they lost in the 7 Years' War that they lost in the Treaty of 1763. And this palpable desire for revanche is going to play mightily into the French Revolution. Because when, just a few years later, just about a dozen years later, the very colonies of British North America that were the base for defeating French Quebec rebelled against Britain, France now has an opportunity for revanche. Now, the French at first play it coy, and they should. Are these American colonials, are they going to be tough enough to actually fight against the British and not get destroyed? The French know how tough the British can be in war, and they can be really tough. We don't think of Englishmen in America as being particularly, masculine, manly because they're so polite. That's the stereotype. The British have a history of warfare that is right up there with the Spartans. I mean, they're not a warrior people, but they are good at war, and they are good at fighting on sea, on land, in the air. The British just are a tough people when you push them. They don't seem like it on the surface, but go down deep and you'll find iron, you'll find steel. So the Americans have to prove themselves, and they do in the 1777 Battle of Saratoga, which happens in upstate New York in the Hudson River Valley. The French have sent an army from Canada under Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne south to New York. If they can make it all the way to New York City, along the Hudson River and up north of that Lake Champlain, what they can do is they can cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, and this will be the beginning of a winning strategy for the British. Thus far, the Americans have not won any major battle on land. They won a few sea battles, they won a few skirmishes, but nothing that was really serious. George Washington's army has had to retreat and retreat and retreat every time the British square up against them. So when at the Battle of Saratoga, the colonials beat the British in an open field battle, European style, this gets the French attention. In Paris, and at Versailles, should I say, Benjamin Franklin is also whispering the possibilities of revanche through joining with the Americans. And after Saratoga, the French are willing to do this. Ultimately, they send a battle fleet under Admiral de Grasse and an army to help George Washington. The Marquis de Lafayette preceded them. He came as a volunteer. He was a French aristocrat who really believed in the Enlightenment philosophies, and so he was willing to come and to lend whatever help he could. But the French send a real army. Ultimately, this leads to the Battle of Yorktown, where a British army ends up having to retreat down near the point of a peninsula because they think that their fleet will support them and they'll be able to draw the Americans into the open and destroy them. The problem is the French fleet under de Grasse bottles up the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay, and so now the British fleet and army are cut off. The French at sea and a Franco-American army on land. Ultimately, the Battle of Yorktown is a siege, and it is won by General Washington, and revanche is accomplished. The French don't get Quebec back, but Britain loses these 13 colonies on the mainland of North America that they had invested so much in. The French also get other considerations elsewhere, but mainly they have smacked perfidious Albion, which is another name for England. They've smacked England around, and they have demonstrated French mastery again, and they can be proud, which is important to France. Le gloire de France, and I don't speak French, but I'm trying to say the glory of France matters to Frenchmen. So, France gets revenge. However, bankrolling the American Revolution and paying for that army and de Grasse's battle fleet cost more money than France has. So France goes into massive debt supporting the American Revolution. In fact, what France does is it bankrupts its economy. This is a problem. If you don't have money, your government can't function, your economy is going to grind to a halt, people are going to panic, they're going to do stupid things, make stupid laws, and it just is bad. You don't want your country to go bankrupt. You don't want your country's government to run out of money because it will get and people will get desperate. And desperate people often make the most boneheaded decisions you can possibly imagine. So America, in some ways, is the nemesis, or leads to the nemesis of the French monarchy. Now we go to the actual monarchs. King Louis XV presides over a lot of what happens, but Louis XVI comes to power. Louis XVI is the great-grandson of Louis XIV. And he is, when he takes power, a teenage schlub. He is awkward, like a lot of 14-year-old boys are. He is socially inept. He doesn't really get people. He doesn't really understand them. His hobby, what he loves to do, is locksmithing. Why? Think about what it means to play around with locks. It's quiet. Everything's logical. Everything fits into place. There's none of the emotional vagaries that human relationships have. There's none of the complexity. It's peaceful. It's quiet. And it's solitary. And Louis XVI, as a prince, loves those things. However, even though he's just in his mid-teens, the job of a crown prince, or in the case of the French, the Dauphin, is to have kids, because you need an heir and a spare to secure the monarchy. You need for political stability. You need generations of people, so that everyone knows when the old king dies who the new king will be. If you remember why the Roman Empire falls, one of the key reasons is the lack of a succession law, because of the Augustan lie that Rome is still a republic, even though when Augustus became the imperator, Rome became a monarchy. But the Romans never admitted that to themselves. They always played the game, even during the Dominate at the end of the empire, they always played the game that the emperor was not a king. So they never had a law that said that the eldest son of the emperor, or whoever is the next male heir, becomes emperor when the old emperor dies. And in the 3rd century, in the 200s AD, Rome literally rips itself up for over 60 years, fighting endless civil wars over who will be the new emperor when the old emperor dies, and you end up with generals fighting one another for being, oh, I have succeeded, I'm emperor, for like 3 months until the next general overthrows him. And this critically weakens Rome, and it continues to be a problem. So Louis XVI needs to have heirs, male heirs. And to do that, he's going to need a wife. During the 7 Years' War, France made an ally of the Habsburg house that ruled Austria. And the ruler of Austria during this time was the Empress Maria Therese. She's one of the few female rulers in Central European history. And she's not a bad ruler. She's actually a pretty effective empress. And she has a daughter, a young daughter, 14-year-old girl named Antoine. Well, a marriage alliance is agreed. And Antoine is going to be sent to France to become the wife of the crown prince, or the Dauphin of France, who will be later Louis XVI. So, beautiful, effervescent cheerleader type, blonde, a little airheady. She is sent to join her new family. And I showed you clips of this last week from Marie Antoinette, assuming you watched them. And it is a culture shock. It is a culture. She has to give up everything of Austria, even her dog. She can't have jewelry. She can't have clothing. Everything has to be French. She is now Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette is going to be the Dauphine, or the crown princess, the wife of the crown prince. So they get married. But they don't have sex. And believe me, in Versailles, people know if royals have sex or not. You actually, on the wedding night, have you have like 20 people in the room, including the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris and the king, wishing them a good night and good luck, good work, and the curtains are closed, and people leave except for a few servants who are hanging around the outer edges of the room, just waiting in case the royal couple needs anything. Uh, Nothing happens the first night, or the second night, or the first month, or the first year. They try and they fail to have kids. Year after year after year. Now, these are teenagers who are married. Marie Antoinette is pretty. Louis, the future Louis XVI, may be a bit of a schlub, but he's going to be the king of France. Henry Kissinger once said that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. So things should work, but they're not. Now, if this had been Germany, it would have been bad enough. If it had been Britain, it would have been bad enough. But this is France! And as it is France, what are things that the French are vain about? Well, they're vain about their cooking. We have snails. We are so good at cooking. We can make snails into a gourmet feast. And they do. If you've ever had a good dish of escargot, you know that snails can be very tasty. Then again, most things in the garlic butter can be. But what else do the French pride themselves on? Oh, they are the world's best lovers. So what they expect from their monarchs is amorous ability. They expect them to be good lovers because, French. Soon, the libel is that the locksmith can't find the keyhole. This is French street gossip. Everyone in France knows that Louis XVI is not impregnating Marie Antoinette. And they revile him for it. And they revile them. What's she doing wrong? What's he doing wrong? Do they not understand the birds and the bees? Do they not understand how nature works? The locksmith can't find the keyhole. God. Here's the problem. The young Louis XVI suffers from a birth defect called phimosis. What it has to do with is a flap of skin attached to the foreskin of the male member, making arousal intensely painful. The solution is a surgery. But you tell me any man that wants anything like surgery down there. He doesn't want it. And year after year after year, he resists. Finally, when it becomes almost unbearable, the snotty, nasty rumors about them, finally he agrees to the surgery. And once he heals up, they start having kids. He has an heir. He has a spare. It works, but the damage is already done. Louis XVI and his young wife have become objects of ridicule. The predators smell blood. And everything that they do after that is going to be sneered at and laughed at because the French people have grown accustomed to sneering and laughing at this particular couple. The people of France are frustrated. And that frustration is increasing. And it's not simply because of the crown prince and princess, later the king and queen, not having successfully achieved having children for a while. The government is bankrupt. Government services are breaking down. France has a bad winter, and then lesser crop, and then they're heading towards another bad winter. So the people of France have become familiar with hunger. The poorest people, very, very familiar. The middle class in France wants change. And even the new king, Louis XVI, realizes that something needs to happen. We have a government that has no money. At the same time, we've got a culture at Versailles that is absolutely ridiculously expensive. Everyone has to keep up with the fashion, remember? You got these massive feasts. It's a way of trapping the nobility, and it works at that. But when you don't have money, if you have massive feasts and 10 miles or 5 miles away from Versailles, people are starving to death because they can't get a hold of a potato or a loaf of bread, that's bad. So, the king is going to need to convene something that he and his ancestors haven't had to worry about for a good long time. The king is going to have to convene l'État Général. L'État Général, the Estates General, is the French Parliament. The French Parliament, I remind you, is not made of two houses like the English Parliament, House of Lords, House of Commons. The French Parliament has three. The third estate is the House of Commons. The third estate is for everyday people, and it really represents the middle class, the upper middle class, lawyers, doctors, architects, people like that, bankers. The second estate are the noblemen, the aristocracy, their House of Lords. What's the first estate in l'État Général? Any of you remember? Writing down. First estate is the church. The Roman Catholic Church controls 1/3 of the French legislature. And the reason for this is the ancient alliance between the Roman Catholic Church and the Kingdom of France that goes back before Charlemagne. With the church, a loyal ally of the king, and with the French nobility, presumably as loyal allies of the king, the French kings have been able to dominate their parliament. And the third estate, even though it's the least reliable of the three to do what the king wants, the third estate very much has its own mind. They're outvoted 2-1 in terms of the legislature and the way they count votes. Every time something happens, if the third estate wants to go one way, the king, the nobility, and the church go the other way, the third estate gets outvoted, even though the third estate represents the vast majority of the French people. Well, at this point, as l'État Général comes together and the French king says we need to raise more money or the government's going to collapse, the estates do something that the king doesn't expect. They insist that he appoint a new finance minister, a new chief financial officer, someone who is going to reestablish the monetary basis of French power. His name is Jacques Necker. Jacques Necker is the one who the third estate and others in the first and second estate want and demand that the king make finance ministers so that he can reestablish the French monarchy on a financially solvent basis. The king doesn't want to do this because he knows Necker has some ideas that will change things in Versailles and around. Now, the thing you've got to understand about Louis XVI, he is a creature of Versailles. That Versailles culture, this is Versailles. That Versailles culture that Louis XIV created as a hypnotic trap for the nobility, the endless rituals, the exact way of doing everything. Louis XIV created those to beguile and confuse and entrap the nobles of France, and it worked. Because Louis XIV was a strong individual who was capable of overruling any of these things that he created. But Louis XVI grew up as the great-grandson of Louis XIV. He grew up in this illusory world, this chamber of endless reflection, this carnival funhouse of mirrors that was Versailles, where there is a way of doing everything and everything has its place and there are rituals and everything has to have, and it's all so expensive and it's all so time consuming and it's all so inefficient. Louis XVI may be king, but he is ruled by the ritual of the court, the very ritual his great-granddad set up to trap everyone else in France. Well, now it's trapped the king. So the king has difficulty thinking in terms other than Versailles culture, because that's what he knew. That's what he grew up with. So he agrees. He appoints Jacques Necker. And in the summer of 1789, as food problems continue to plague the French, and as the starving time of August approaches, Necker makes a series of financial recommendations that will fundamentally change how the French monarchy does business. The king cannot imagine how these changes will actually work. He can't imagine agreeing to them, because one of the changes goes beyond finances. With Jacques Necker, the Third Estate is demanding a partnership relationship with the king. Does this sound at all familiar? Because it's the same sort of thing that Parliament demanded of King Charles the First, right before the English Civil War. The Parliament wanted to be the partner with the king. They didn't want to be a subject, they wanted to be a partner, maybe even an equal partner, maybe even a superior partner. Well, the Third Estate in particular wants more power. They are sick of being outvoted by priests and noblemen, when priests and noblemen make up less than 10% of the French population. They want to be treated like an equal partner by the king. But this is an absolute monarchy. Louis XVI cannot imagine giving up that kind of power, nor can he imagine making the financial belt tightenings that Necker wants. So, what Louis does is similar to what Charles did. Louis closes l'État Général, and he fires Jacques Necker. Says we'll find another way. So, the next morning, as the representatives of the First and Second Estate ride home, the representatives of the Third Estate show up at their chambers, which had been set aside for them to work at Versailles, close to the king. And there's a sign nailed to the door saying that the king has dismissed l'État Général. He thanks the members of the Third Estate for their work, and they can go home now. The Third Estate's representatives instead go across the street to a handball court, what history will remember as a tennis court. And there they convene a meeting. First of all, they make the tennis court oath, which is a promise to France, to God, and to one another. They're not going anywhere. They're staying right here, and they're going to do the key people's business. Come what may, they will not disperse. They will defy the king until the king recognizes that they are immovable and they are going to be his partners, whether he likes it or not. They even changed their name. They're sick of the First and Second Estate anyway, so they call themselves now the National Assembly. Not the Third Estate anymore, the National Assembly. They are going to be the Parliament of the French people. And this National Assembly is going to begin working on a document what will be called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. We'll get to that. Throughout all of this, the king watches. He dithers. Like Hamlet, he doesn't know what to do. He could do this. He could do that. There are no easy choices. And he is not the kind of man to grab history by the throat and squeeze until he gets what he wants. The king does nothing. He lets it slide. Had people defied Louis XIV, or even Louis XV, the grandfather of Louis XVI, bayonets would have been used. The French army would have been called in and cleared out these uppity carpenters and lawyers, and that would have been that. Mischief managed, problem solved, little blood makes the grass grow. But Louis XVI is not that kind of man. Instead, he goes hunting. He's thinking about what to do. Meanwhile, the heat is on. And Paris, again, is much hotter than here in the summertime. It's like Virginia. It's hot and humid in a way that it almost never gets in the western United States. And as the heat is on, the people of Paris eagerly await the next proclamation from the National Assembly. They're in it to win it. They want this. They're happy with this. And then a rumor starts, like a spark in a hay barn after a drought. The king has mobilized the army. The king is coming to Paris. And when the king comes to Paris, the revolution will be gone. There will be no National Assembly. In fact, some of the rumors say that the king has already arrested the National Assembly. The people of Paris erupt. They start building barricades in the streets. And at this time, Paris is a rat warren of little streets, no big avenues like it has now. That came later. So the people of Paris fortify each city block like it's its own castle. They blockade the streets with piles of rubble and debris, and they have to arm themselves. Well, there's one place in the center of Paris where everyone can see. It's a medieval castle called the Bastille, or the Bastille. The Bastille is an old castle that is used for two purposes today. It's a pre-gunpowder era castle, so it's got tall, relatively thin walls. After the age of gunpowder, instead of having tall walls, what you do is you have deep moats, and cannons can't blow through. It's a very different way of building fortifications. You build them out rather than up. The Bastille is an old pre-gunpowder fortification. It is used as a prison, and it is used as an armory. That's where the gunpowder is. That's where the guns are. That's where the ammunition, the musket balls are. So, the Paris mob forms. Now, full disclosure, I hate mobs, personally, deeply, viscerally, because I've seen them with my own eyes. In 1977, it was a long, hot summer in the Bronx, New York City. I was visiting my grandparents. My father worked third shift in the boiler room at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. So at around 9:30 or 10, he left the apartment. We were on the fifth floor walk up, and went down to the street corner to get the bus to get to work on time. He worked the 11 to 7 shift. So he left the house, and we saw him. We looked out the window and waved, and when he was at the bus stop, he couldn't really see us. We were too far away, but we could see him. There was a Yankee game on. I remember that too. And then later, about 10 or 15 minutes after my grandfather left, after the bus left, the power went out all over the city of New York. This is the blackout of 1977. Now, there had been a blackout a month before I was born in November of 1965. And in that blackout, well, things were calm and peaceful, and 9 months later, a hell of a lot of babies were born because people found something to do in the dark in November of 1965. But this is not what happened in 1977. The city between 65 and 77 had been riven by a series of race riots. Whole neighborhoods had burned down. It was a sport and a way of making a living in the Bronx to burn down your own building to try to collect the insurance money and get out because you couldn't sell any property because nobody would buy anything in the Bronx or in some of the other neighborhoods of New York City. New York City actually had gone bankrupt a couple of years before, in 1974. So the city, in many ways, was a very different place. And hot summers in a crowded city are always possible sources of riot. My grandma and I saw across the Cross Bronx Expressway, it was in a trench near where we were, so we could look across it. There was this little mini mall with this little triangular parking lot. And people began to gather across that. And soon the crowd got loud and they started breaking through the store windows and looting everything. And then we could see the crowd, the mob now. It's no longer a crowd of people, it's a mob moving to another store and moving to another store. The people in our building got whatever we could: baseball bats, hockey sticks, knives, whatever, cleavers. And we were ready to defend our building. I remember that. It was kind of scary. But it was a poor Irish neighborhood. There wasn't much there. That night, you can look up the blackout riots of 1977 in New York City on YouTube, and you will see crowds of people, mobs of people running through the street, holding television sets and dragging washing machines, shouting, "It's Christmas Day for the poor." Anyone that got in their way got beaten to a bloody pulp. The police were doing their best just to hold things from causing massive fires. Because in an environment like this, with no electric power, if a fire starts, it's going to be very hard to put out. The question of water pressure in the mains is a real one. So all that night, the mob went wild. The next morning was an important day in the history of rap music, because suddenly you've got ghetto kids around New York City with the best sound mixing equipment on earth, because they had benefited from the people who raided the electronic stores, the music stores. A mob is not a crowd. A mob is analogous to grasshoppers becoming a locust swarm. A grasshopper is sort of dark green in color with light green bits. It's got a certain type of carapace and it makes certain sounds and it acts as an individual, according to instinct. That's what a grasshopper does. But every so often in the tropical places of the world, the grasshoppers begin to come together and crowd one another and rub up against one another, and they begin making a different noise. Their carapaces become spiky, their coloration darkens, and they become a locust swarm. This locust swarm does not act like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals. It acts like a single mass, a single being. It reaches out into the world and it consumes. When a locust swarm passes over a field of grain, there's nothing left of the grain. It eats everything. It's like an airborne piranha swarm. You don't want to be a person out in the locust swarm. You will go crazy. You may die. It's just too much, the press of bodies, little tiny insect bodies around you. When a human being is faced with a mob, the same thing happens to us. No one in their right minds is going to say, "You know what I want to do this evening? I want to go out and run through the streets and burn cars and steal stuff." Yeah, I can understand steal stuff, but burn cars and beat people and rape people and maybe cause a fire that'll wipe out my whole neighborhood. And I'm going to loot the stores in my neighborhood so that when this is all over, I'll have nowhere to get food. Mobs don't act like individuals. Mobs act from a common desire to destroy. And when you're in a mob, your individuality goes bye-bye. You sacrifice it on the altar of the group. And you lose your willingness to stand against the group and say no. I've seen it happen. The blackout riots were the worst case where I saw it happen. But when individuals give up their conscience, their individuality, and join a mob, watch out, because anything is possible. The Paris mob forms, and on 14th July 1789, they attack the Bastille. At first, they demand of the prison commander, the commandant, "Let us in! We are the people of Paris. In the name of the people of Paris, we demand you let us in." The Bastille is a prison and an armory. It's not really a fortress anymore. Its ability to withstand a mob armed with, pointy things and clubby things is limited. The mob breaks in, captures the prison guards, releases the prisoners, takes the weapons, takes the gunpowder, takes the ammunition. Now, all of that I can understand. But what is about to happen is an indication of what mobs really are. On the one hand, for the next few weeks, the Bastille is going to be dismantled by the people of Paris, stone by stone. It's like they want mementos of it. They just hate this thing, the symbol of royal power. So they're going to take it apart stone by stone. That actually doesn't even surprise me. We did that with the Berlin Wall when it fell in 1989. Germans and others took pieces of the wall and they literally took that hateful symbol of oppression apart piece by piece. Now, this is what is hard to understand. This is what is mind-boggling. The mob that holds the commandant and his guards says, "You know what? You didn't say yes to us. We're the people of Paris, and you didn't honor our authority. You kept talking about your duty to the king. Well, we've got an answer for that." And they dragged the prisoners out into the street one by one, ripped their heads off, and stuck them on pikes. They had a pike party, dancing in the streets, being sprinkled by the blood and gore that came out of the necks of the severed heads of the camp commandant and all of his guards. Now, no sane human being in his right mind is going to say, "Yeah, what I want to do this evening is I want to rip a guy's head off and dance around in the sprinkling gore from his neck." But that's what they did. And they did it to the entire garrison. That's a mob. The Paris mob is going to come together like a locust swarm again and again, and it is going to direct the revolution until somebody stands up to it. And it's going to be a long time before somebody does. Bastille Day is still remembered by the French as French Independence Day. It is their version of July 4th. It's July 14th. So ask Dr. LeBlanc if you have anything to do with her about Bastille Day, and she'll tell you about it. And she will tell you probably a very different story. But the Paris mob initiated it by breaking into the Bastille prison, freeing the prisoners, getting the weapons and ammo, and ripping the heads off the guards and the camp commandant, and dancing around in their sprinkled gore and blood. This is the real beginning of the French Revolution. And we will leave things there until tomorrow. Any questions? Seeing none, I will wish you at home a happy day.